Genesis chapters 7 and 8. As you remember, in our last time together, we walked through Genesis chapter 3. We were introduced into Adam and Eve and the role that they play in God's big story. As you remember, they're tasked with tending to the garden and the animals that inhabit it. And in chapter 3, they encounter a serpent who proceeds to tempt them to question what God had told them. And ultimately, in the midst of this temptation, Adam and Eve choose to be disobedient to the Lord. They choose to eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, the one tree God asked them not to, and in doing so, introduce the world to sin. And it's through this sin that they receive consequences, both Adam and Eve, and even the serpent who deceived them. Now, these consequences ultimately culminated in them being expelled from the garden. And that kind of brings us all the way up to chapter 7. So we're going to jump ahead a little bit. So I wanted to take just a minute to kind of give a brief overview of what happens in Genesis chapters 4 through 6. So in chapter 4, we're introduced to Cain and Abel, two of Adam and Eve's sons. And in chapter 4, we see that Cain, who's a farmer, and Abel, who's a shepherd, come to the point where they're asked to present an offering to the Lord. And Cain chooses to give some of his excess crops that the land has produced for him to the Lord as his offering. And Abel chooses to take from his firstborn lambs the best portions he can find and present those to the Lord. When the Lord looks down on these two offerings, he is very pleased with Abel's offering, but he's less than enthused with Cain's offering. Thus creates a little bit of jealousy between the brothers. Cain wanted the Lord to like his offering, and obviously it fell short. Ultimately, one day, Cain convinces Abel to go out into the fields with him, and Cain does the unthinkable. He kills his brother Abel out of jealousy. When the Lord finds out what happened, he enacts a punishment, much like he did with Adam and Eve, Cain's parents, and Cain no longer would be able to produce crops from the ground, and he would no longer have a place he could call home. He'll be forced to be a wanderer for the rest of his life. And through the end of chapter 4, that brings us to chapter 5, which walks through Adam's family tree. It goes through the various descendants of Adam, ultimately branching all the way out to the character in our story today, Noah. And that's pretty much what chapter 6 is setting up chapter 7 and 8. So when God looks down on the earth in Noah's time, he sees a much different place than he originally created. The sin that Adam and Eve introduced in the world has run rampant. It's interacted with every possible thing it can and corrupted it. So when the Lord looks down on his beautiful creation, he sees nothing but evilness and sin everywhere he looks. He's so displeased with what he sees that he even begins to regret even creating the world in the first place. He's so dissatisfied with what he sees, he decides he's going to wipe everything he created out. And that is until he finds Noah. And Noah is the one person on earth who is able to find favor in the eyes of the Lord. So when the Lord sees Noah, he chooses that he's going to push the reset button on creation and use Noah to reset the world that he created. And in doing so, he's going to wipe out all the living things on earth through a flood. And to spare Noah from this flood, God gives him the task of building an ark. And as most of you have probably studied as a kid, one of the most popular Bible stories, Noah's Ark. So Noah is tasked with building an ark. And not just an ark for Noah and his family, an ark that's big enough to hold Noah, his family, and two of every living creature the Lord had created. And so as you can imagine, that's going to be a pretty big boat. And so that's kind of where chapter 6 leaves us. It shows us that the rest of the world has moved far from God. They're no longer honoring him and the things that they do. And so we see Noah tasked with this almost impossible task of building an ark big enough to hold all of these animals. And together we're going to walk through chapter 7 and 8 and see how this story plays out. So I encourage you to get your Bibles out. Today we have Kirsten again who's going to read for us. So flip over to Genesis chapter 7 and 8 and follow along with us.
Genesis chapter 7. The flood covers the earth. When everything was ready, the Lord said to Noah, "Go into the boat with all your family, For among all the people of the earth, I can see that you alone are righteous. Take with you 7 pairs, male and female, of each animal I have approved for eating and for sacrifice, and take 1 pair of each of the others. Also take 7 pairs of every kind of bird. There must be a male and a female in each pair to ensure that all life will survive on the earth after the flood. 7 days from now, I will make the rains pour down on the earth, and it will rain for 40 days and 40 nights until I have wiped from the earth all the living things I have created. So Noah did everything as the Lord commanded him. Noah was 600 years old when the flood covered the earth. He went on board the boat to escape the flood, he and his wife and his sons and their wives. With them were all the various kinds of animals, those approved for eating and for sacrifice, and those that were not, along with all the birds and the small animals that scurry along the ground. They entered the boat in pairs, male and female, just as God had commanded Noah. After 7 days, the water of the flood came and covered the earth. When Noah was 600 years old, on the 17th day of the 2nd month, all the underground waters erupted from the earth, and the rain fell in mighty torrents from the sky. The rain continued to fall for 40 days and 40 nights. That very day, Noah had gone into the boat with his wife and his sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and their wives. With them in the boat were pairs of every kind of animal, domestic and wild, large and small, along with birds of every kind. 2 by 2 they came into the boat, representing every living thing that breathes. A male and female of each kind entered, just as God had commanded Noah. Then the Lord closed the door behind them. For 40 days the flood waters grew deeper, covering the ground and lifting the boat high above the earth. As the waters rose higher and higher above the ground, the boat floated safely on the surface. Finally, the water covered even the highest mountains on the earth, rising more than 22 feet above the highest peaks. All the living things on earth died: birds, domestic animals, wild animals, small animals that scurry along the ground, and all the people. Everything that breathed and lived on dry land died. God wiped out every living thing on earth: people, livestock, small animals that scurry along the ground, and the birds of the sky. All were destroyed. The only people who survived were Noah and those with him in the boat, and the floodwaters covered the earth for 150 days. Genesis chapter 8. The flood recedes. But God remembered Noah and all the wild animals and livestock with him in the boat. He sent a wind to blow across the earth, and the floodwaters began to recede. The underground water stopped flowing, and the torrential rains from the sky were stopped. So the floodwaters gradually receded from the earth. After 150 days, exactly 5 months from the time the flood began, the boat came to rest on the mountains of Ararat. 2.5 months later, as the waters continued to go down, other mountain peaks became visible. After another 40 days, Noah opened the window he had made on the boat and released a raven. The bird flew back and forth until the floodwaters on the earth had dried up. He also released a dove to see if the water had receded and it could find dry ground. But the dove could find no place to land because the water still covered the ground. So it returned to the boat. And Noah held out his hand and drew the dove back inside. After waiting another 7 days, Noah released the dove again. This time the dove returned to him in the evening with the fresh olive leaf in its beak. Then Noah knew that the floodwaters were almost gone. He waited another 7 days and then released the dove again. This time it did not come back. Noah was now 601 years old. On the first day of the new year, 10.5 months after the flood began, the floodwaters had almost dried up from the earth. Noah lifted back the covering of the boat and saw that the surface of the ground was drying. 2 more months went by, and at last the earth was dry. Then God said to Noah, "Leave the boat, all of you, you and your wife and your sons and their wives. Release all the animals, the birds, the livestock, and the small animals that scurry along the ground, so they can be fruitful and multiply throughout the earth." So Noah, his wife, and his sons and their wives left the boat, and all the large and small animals and birds came out of the boat pair by pair. Then Noah built an altar to the Lord, and there he sacrificed as burnt offerings the animals and birds that had been approved for that purpose. And the Lord was pleased with the aroma of the sacrifice, and said to himself, I will never again curse the ground because of the human race. Even though everything they think or imagine is bent toward evil from childhood, I will never again destroy all living things. As long as the earth remains, there will be a planting and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night.
Thanks, Kirsten. So after reading through Genesis chapter 7 and 8, we see that Noah was able to accomplish this task that God gave him. He was able to devote years and years of his life to building the ark, and that God was faithful in his promise that he did send a flood to wipe out the entire earth, to all the living creatures and all of mankind. And it's almost one of those things that's unbelievable. It's hard to imagine what this situation looked like on earth when Noah was thousands of feet above ground, floating on a boat in a world that was completely flooded. And we see that God accomplished his task. He wasn't happy with his creation. He wasn't happy with the path that they had chosen to take, and with the corruption that sin was able to have on the world that he created. So he wanted to start over, and he chose Noah as the person that he was going to start over with. And so as an adult looking at this story that we typically associate more with the children's department than with the adults in the church, I try to look for things that we can learn from this story too. And I think one of those things that we can look at is, in the midst of all this corruption and all this evilness, what stood out about Noah's life to God? What made God recognize Noah in the midst of all this destruction around him? And I think it's evident in the life of Noah in this story that it's his faithfulness. Even in the midst of everyone around him turning from God, Noah was still faithful to the Lord. And we can see that in that he chose to devote his time to accomplish the task at hand. He built a boat that the massive size of alone is unfathomable. Much less the amount of time it took to build it in Noah's day, and all the people around him questioning why he's doing it and how crazy he is, that there's not even a need for a boat this big. What's he wasting all this time on? When I think about in my own life, when there's tasks that seem impossible, seem like I'll never be able to get this done or accomplish that, and people around you start to question, like, why are you spending so much time working on that? And there's no point in doing this or doing that. It starts to lead you to question, well, did God really call me to do this? Did God really ask for me to dedicate this time to this task? And we see in the life of Noah that he did, and Noah was able to be faithful, and that shows the character that God saw in him, even from the beginning. And I think not only that, when we see the flood waters recede and Noah be able to return to dry ground, we see Noah's first response to God's provision is to build an altar and to worship him. That's something that we can relate to a lot today. You think about, like, as a kid, when you're getting ready to get your driver's license, everyone asks, oh, where's the first place you're going to drive to? Or when you go on a diet for months at a time and someone's like, oh, what's the first food you want to eat when you get done with that? Or, say you've been cooped up in your house for weeks on end with nowhere to go or anything, and people are like, oh, what's the first thing you want to do when life gets back to normal? A lot of times our responses to those questions are far from anything related to the Lord. But not so for Noah. His first reaction was to worship God. And I think that says a lot about Noah, and that shows us why he stood out to God. And that almost serves as a model for us. A lot of times we compare the days of Noah to the current time we're living in. There's a lot of corruption and sin everywhere we look as well. So what can we do in this corrupt world to stand out, to be a light for the Lord? And I think that faithfulness to the task that God's called us to, and that faithfulness to worshiping him, are some of the things that help you stand out amongst the crowd. So as we're looking at Noah and his life and his choice to be faithful to the Lord, I just wanted to ask you guys, how do you respond when God calls you to something that seems impossible? Are you like Noah in that you're sold out 100%? You want to do whatever the Lord calls you to do, no matter what, no matter the people around you? Or do you think it's easier for you to give in to the crowd? You know, if enough people come up to you and question what you're doing, are you able to, you know, do you just give up on what God's called you to do and give in to the ways of the world? It's not that you're a bad person or anything if you feel like it's hard to live up to these tasks that seem impossible, but it just means there's an area for you to grow in your relationship with the Lord. You know, that's the awesome thing about God, is He wants to have a relationship with us. You know, when things seem impossible, He wants us to reach out to Him, and He'll reassure us that, no, this is exactly what I want you to be doing. I want you to be, you know, living in my will. You know, the rest of the world's going to think it's foolish because they don't have a relationship with me. And I think that's just a testament to how powerful a Christian life can be. You know, when we live our lives sold out to what God's called us to do, you know, we can make waves in this world. People don't understand why we do those type of things. And that's what God calls us to do. Now, I don't know if you come up to me and tell me that God calls you to build an ark like Noah did, that I would really take you too seriously, but you never know. You know, even in this time that we're living in now, it's completely different. You know, things have changed in a matter of, 2 months. Our life looks completely different than it did. And, you know, there's things that we're called to do now in this time. You know, God has a plan for us. You know, the world had never been flooded before when Noah built the ark and took his family on there, and he didn't know what was going to happen. But he was still faithful to the Lord. And I think that's something we can learn from, even in this time where we're not sure what's going on or what's going to happen next, that we know as long as we're faithful to the Lord, that He'll provide for us, He'll meet our needs, and we just have to be ready when He calls to step up to the plate and do what He wants us to do. And when He sees us through this difficult time, to be ready to worship Him and to get back together as a family of God and, just praise Him for His provision. So in saying that, if you guys have any prayer requests or any questions about anything, feel free to leave them down below the video. And we'll be happy to be, to pray for each other and to be encouraging to one another during this time when we're unable to get out and be together. I thank you guys for listening to our life group each week. Like I've said before, the goal is to be interactive, so please feel free to leave any questions that you may have, any comments, anything about Noah's story that sticks out to you, that maybe I didn't mention in the video, that we can learn together as a family of believers. And as we wrap up this week, I just want to encourage you to reflect on the idea of faithfulness. Faithfulness is something that a lot of the men and women that God finds favor in have in common. Is faithfulness, is that something that you desire? Are you being faithful to the things God is calling you to do even today? And I think as we go throughout this week, we can, pray and ask God to help us to be more faithful, help us to see what He's calling us to do, and to have the courage and the boldness to step out and do those things and to be faithful to Him, even in the difficult times. I love you guys. I'll be praying for you. We'll see you next week. Okay, one more time.
Thanks for watching. See you next time.
Bye.
Bye.
You can blow him a kiss.